Put the badge down now, the man said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the entire room freeze. And for a brief second no one moved. No one even breathed, because just hours earlier that same man had been the one standing alone at the doorway, ignored, mocked, dismissed like he didn't belong there. And if you had walked into that precinct at 7:12 a.m., you would have seen Marcus Reed for what everyone else thought he was. A new hire, a rookie, just another name on the schedule. But what you wouldn't have seen, what none of them saw, was the silence behind his eyes, the kind of silence that doesn't come from uncertainty, but from knowing exactly when to speak and when to wait, the kind of silence that watches, measures, and remembers everything. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly as Marcus stepped inside, the hum of old wiring filling the air along with the low murmur of conversations that didn't stop when he entered. They just shifted, quieter, sharper, like a room deciding what to make of him before he even had a chance to introduce himself. A few officers leaned against their desks, coffee cups in hand, eyes scanning him up and down without any attempt to hide it. One of them let out a short laugh under his breath, not loud enough to be called out, but just loud enough to be heard. And then came the voice, smooth, confident, carrying the kind of casual authority that came from years of never being questioned. "You lost, rookie?" Marcus turned slightly, his gaze landing on Ethan Cole, a senior officer with a pressed uniform and a smirk that looked like it had never once been challenged. The room shifted again, attention narrowing, waiting, because moments like this always meant something, always set the tone, and Marcus could feel it, not just the words, but what sat underneath them, the assumptions, the judgment, the quiet decision already made about who he was supposed to be in this space. He could have responded, could have corrected him, could have said something sharp enough to cut through the room, but he didn't. Instead, he adjusted the folder in his hand, the edge of it brushing against his palm as if grounding him in something deeper than the moment itself. "First day?" Ethan continued, stepping closer now, his boots echoing faintly against the tile floor. "Try not to mess anything up." A few chuckles followed, scattered, uneasy, but enough to signal agreement. And still Marcus said nothing, his expression steady, unreadable, like he was listening to something else entirely, something beyond the room, beyond the noise. A veteran officer near the back glanced at him, just for a second, then looked away, as if recognizing something he couldn't quite place. Captain Blake stood near the glass office overlooking the floor, arms crossed, watching, not intervening, not correcting, just observing. And that was the part no one noticed, the way his eyes lingered on Marcus a fraction longer than they should have, the way the room seemed to hold a tension that hadn't fully surfaced yet. Marcus finally spoke, his voice even, controlled, almost quiet, noted. And it wasn't the kind of response anyone expected, not defensive, not aggressive, just a single word that landed differently than it should have, like it carried a meaning no one else understood yet. Ethan smirked wider, taking it as submission, as confirmation of exactly what he thought this was, another new guy who would fall in line, who would learn quickly where he stood. But Marcus had already moved past the moment, stepping further into the precinct, his eyes briefly scanning the layout, the desks, the faces, the small details others ignored, a camera mounted high in the corner, a stack of reports left open on a desk, a conversation that stopped a little too quickly when he walked by. He didn't react, didn't acknowledge any of it, but he saw it, all of it, because this wasn't just his first day, and this wasn't just another assignment, even if that's exactly what they believed. And as the clock ticked forward, as the morning settled into routine and the laughter faded into background noise, one thing remained quietly in place, unnoticed, unchallenged, waiting, the moment when everything they thought they understood would turn, not with force, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, the truth. The morning did not get quieter, it just got sharper, like every sound inside the precinct carried a second meaning now. The scrape of a chair, the click of a pen, the low hum of conversation that always seemed to dip whenever Marcus passed by. And if you were paying attention, really paying attention, you would have noticed how nothing he did was rushed, how every step he took was measured, like he was already 10 moves ahead in a game no one else realized they were playing. He set his folder down at an empty desk, near the edge of the room, not the center, not where attention lived, but where observation thrived. From there he could see everything. Ethan leaning back in his chair like he owned the place. Two officers arguing quietly over a report that did not quite add up. A clipboard left unattended with names that had been crossed out and rewritten more than once. Small things, insignificant things, unless you knew how to read them. You planning to sit there all day? Ethan called out again, louder this time, drawing a few more eyes. Or are you actually going to do something useful? There was a pause, the kind that stretched just long enough to make people uncomfortable. Marcus looked up slowly, not defensive, not irritated, just present. I am already doing something, he said, his tone even. And for a second that answer did not land the way Ethan expected. It did not challenge him, but it did not submit either. It simply existed, and that was enough to throw off the rhythm of the room. Ethan scoffed, shaking his head as if dismissing the moment entirely. But the smirk did not sit as easily on his face this time. Not quite. Across the room, Captain Blake stepped out of his office, his presence alone shifting the air. Conversations tightened, postures straightened, but he did not address the tension directly. Instead, he walked past Marcus without a word, placing a thin stack of files on the central table, files that looked ordinary at first glance. Routine reports, standard documentation, but Marcus's eyes followed them, just briefly, just enough to catch the labels, internal reviews, flagged incidents, dates that lined up a little too neatly, and then he looked away, as if none of it mattered, as if he had not noticed anything at all. The hours moved forward, calls came in, officers rotated in and out, the usual rhythm of a precinct in motion. But underneath it all there was something else building, something quieter, something patient. Marcus remained at his desk, occasionally jotting notes, occasionally glancing up, never inserting himself into conversations, never trying to prove anything. And that was what made it unsettling, because in a place where everyone fought to be seen, he seemed completely comfortable being overlooked. Around mid-morning a call came through that pulled several officers, including Ethan, into a brief discussion, voices overlapping, decisions made quickly, perhaps too quickly. Marcus did not join them, did not ask questions, but his pen moved across the page with quiet precision, capturing details others spoke without thinking, a timestamp, a name, a discrepancy in a statement that did not quite match the report on the table. And then, just as subtly, he closed the folder, resting his hand on top of it for a moment, like sealing something in place. Across the room, that same veteran officer glanced at him again, longer this time, a flicker of recognition passing through his expression before he turned away. And still no one said anything, no one stepped in, because to them this was simple, this was hierarchy, this was a rookie learning his place. But what they did not understand, what they could not see, was that Marcus was not learning the room. He was mapping it, every word, every glance, every careless assumption, all of it quietly recorded, not just on paper, but in the kind of memory that does not forget. And as the clock inched closer to noon, as the noise of the precinct settled into something almost routine again, one thing had already been set in motion, something that would not announce itself with raised voices or sudden action, but with a shift so precise, so controlled, that by the time anyone realized it had happened, it would already be too late to pretend they had not seen it coming. By the time the clock on the far wall clicked past 11:47 a.m., the room had settled into something that looked like routine but felt like pressure, the kind that builds slowly, quietly, without anyone realizing they are already inside it. Marcus had not moved much from his desk, but the space around him had shifted in subtle ways. Conversations no longer stopped completely when he passed, but they changed tone, guarded, measured, like people had begun to sense that he was not just another presence to ignore. Ethan, however, did not adjust. Not yet. He leaned back in his chair again, boots stretched out, voice louder than necessary as he recounted a recent case to a couple of officers nearby, emphasizing his decisions, his instincts, his control, each sentence carefully shaped to reinforce the same image, that he was the one who knew how things worked around here, that he was the standard others were expected to follow. And every now and then his eyes drifted toward Marcus, not directly, but enough to make sure the message carried, enough to remind the room who held the informal power. "You see that?" he said at one point, tapping a file with the back of his pen. "That is how you keep things clean, no loose ends." The words hung in the air a second longer than necessary. And for a brief moment Marcus's pen stopped, not because he was reacting, but because something in that sentence did not align with what he had already seen. The report Ethan referenced, the timestamps Marcus had written down earlier, the statements that did not quite match, small fractures in a story that looked solid on the surface. Marcus lifted his eyes just slightly, not enough to challenge, just enough to confirm. And then he resumed writing, as if nothing had happened, but something had, something quiet, something important. Across the room, Captain Blake checked his watch, then glanced toward the conference room. A signal subtle enough that most missed it, but not all. The veteran officer near the back straightened almost instinctively, like he recognized a shift before it fully arrived. "All right. Listen up," Blake finally said, his voice cutting through the room without needing to rise. "Briefing in 10 minutes. Chairs moved. Conversations broke apart. Energy redirected, and for the first time since Marcus had walked in that morning, the entire precinct began to move in the same direction. The conference room sat just off the main floor, glass walls that made everything visible but revealed nothing about what mattered. One by one the officers filed in, Ethan among the first, still carrying that same relaxed confidence, still assuming the hierarchy would remain exactly as it had always been. Marcus entered last, not rushed, not delayed, simply on time. He took a seat along the side, not at the head, not yet, his folder resting in front of him, closed, untouched, as if it did not hold anything worth noting. The room filled, voices faded, and then came the silence, the kind that only exists right before something changes. Captain Blake stood at the front, hands resting lightly on the table, eyes moving across each face, not quickly, not casually, but deliberately, like he was measuring reactions before they even happened. "Before we begin," he said, pausing just long enough to draw full attention, "there are a few updates to how this unit will be operating." Ethan shifted slightly in his chair, not concerned, just curious, expecting routine adjustments. Nothing more. Marcus did not move at all, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, but his eyes were no longer scanning the room. They were fixed forward, waiting. Blake reached down and picked up a single document, thinner than the others, but somehow heavier in what it represented. "Effective immediately," he continued, and something in his tone altered the air, not louder, not harsher, just final. "All internal case reviews, audits, and procedural oversight will be handled under a new lead." A brief pause followed, not for effect, but because it was necessary, because what came next would not land softly. It would land exactly where it needed to. Blake turned slightly, his gaze settling not on Ethan, not on the center of the room, but on Marcus. "Officer Marcus Reed," he said, clear, direct, leaving no space for interpretation, "will be overseeing all operations moving forward." And in that moment, the silence returned, but this time it was different. This time it was not anticipation, it was realization, the kind that arrives all at once, heavy, undeniable. Ethan's posture shifted, just slightly, the confidence not gone, but interrupted, like a thought that no longer made sense in the context it was placed in. Marcus did not react immediately. He did not stand, did not speak. He simply opened the folder in front of him, slowly, deliberately, revealing pages that had already been written, already been organized, already been understood long before anyone else in that room realized. They were part of something larger than themselves. And when he finally looked up, meeting the room not as someone being evaluated, but as someone who had already finished the evaluation, there was no anger in his expression, no satisfaction, just clarity, the kind that does not need to announce itself, because it has already taken its place. No one spoke for what felt like a full 10 seconds, and in a room that had been filled with noise all morning, that silence did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like every word that had been said earlier was now hanging in the air waiting to be answered. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the pen in his hand, not enough to draw attention, but enough to break the rhythm he had carried all day. He leaned forward just a fraction, eyes narrowing as if trying to reprocess what he had just heard. Because it did not fit, it did not align with the version of reality he had been operating under just minutes ago. Across the table, a couple of officers exchanged brief glances, the kind that asked questions without daring to say them out loud, and Marcus, still seated, turned a single page in his folder, the sound soft but precise, like a marker placed exactly where it needed to be. Captain Blake stepped back slightly, giving space without announcing it, a silent handoff that required no explanation. And that was when Marcus stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just smoothly, like someone stepping into a position that had already been his long before this moment. His chair slid back with a quiet scrape, and every set of eyes in the room followed him whether they intended to or not. He did not rush to speak, did not fill the silence immediately. Instead, he placed both hands lightly on the table, grounding himself in the space, allowing the weight of the moment to settle fully before moving forward. "We will keep this simple," he said, his voice steady, controlled, not loud but impossible to ignore, and something about that tone shifted the room more than any raised voice ever could. It was not authority forced outward, it was authority that already existed. Ethan let out a short breath, almost a scoff, but it did not carry the same confidence as before. "You have got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the two officers beside him to hear. Marcus's gaze moved in his direction, not sharply, not confrontational, just direct. "Officer Cole," he said, and the use of his name landed differently now. Precise, intentional. "You will have an opportunity to speak." He paused for a fraction of a second, just enough to make the next words settle deeper, but not yet. And it was not what he said, it was how he said it. Calm, measured, leaving no room for negotiation. That caused the room to shift again. Ethan leaned back slowly, the motion controlled, but the energy behind it no longer steady. Because for the first time that day, he was not setting the tone, he was responding to it. Marcus continued, opening the folder fully now, revealing not just notes, but structured reports, timestamps aligned, statements cross-referenced, details organized in a way that suggested this had not been put together in a few hours, but over time, with intention. This unit has operated under patterns that require review, Marcus said, not accusing, not emotional, just factual. And starting today, every report, every decision, every procedural step will be evaluated for consistency and accuracy. He turned another page, sliding a document slightly forward, not toward the center, but toward Ethan's side of the table, stopping just short of him, an invitation without force, including this one. Ethan's eyes dropped to the paper for a split second, then lifted again, jaw tightening. "That case is closed," he said quickly, too quickly, the certainty in his voice arriving a fraction ahead of the logic behind it. Marcus did not respond immediately. He let the statement exist in the room, unchallenged for just long enough to make it feel exposed. "That is what the report says," Marcus replied, his tone unchanged. "But the timestamps do not align with the recorded dispatch logs." Another pause, not dramatic, just precise. "And the statements provided do not match the sequence of events as documented." The room felt smaller now, tighter, as if the walls themselves had leaned into. "Listen," the veteran officer near the back shifted his weight slightly, his expression no longer neutral, but attentive, because this was no longer about hierarchy. It was about something else, something more difficult to dismiss. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, then stopped, just for a second, just long enough to reveal that the answer was not as immediate as it should have been. Marcus closed the folder halfway, not fully, leaving it open just enough to suggest that there was more, much more. "We are not here to assign blame," Marcus said, and the words were calm, almost reassuring, but they carried a different kind of weight. "We are here to understand the truth." And that was the moment everything shifted, not because of volume, not because of confrontation, but because the room realized something all at once. The man they had dismissed that morning was not asking for control, he had arrived with it, and now he was deciding how it would be used. The room did not return to normal after that. It could not, because something fundamental had shifted and everyone could feel it even if no one wanted to acknowledge it out loud. The easy confidence that had filled the space earlier was gone, replaced by something tighter, more careful, like every word now had to pass through a second layer of thought before being spoken. Marcus remained standing at the table, not pacing, not asserting himself through movement, but holding the space with a stillness that demanded attention. His eyes moved briefly across the room, not scanning for weakness, but observing reactions. Measuring who understood and who was still trying to deny what had just happened, Ethan finally leaned forward. Again, this time slower, more deliberate, his voice lower but edged with something sharper. "You are basing all this on paperwork," he said, tapping the document in front of him with controlled emphasis. "Reports get messy. Things happen in real time. That does not mean anything is wrong." It was a defense, but not a strong one. More of a reflex than a strategy. Marcus listened without interruption, without even a flicker of impatience. And when Ethan finished, the silence that followed did not feel like a pause. It felt like a decision point. Marcus stepped slightly closer to the table, not into Ethan's space, but close enough to make the conversation unavoidable. "You are right," Marcus said calmly. And for a brief second that agreement created confusion. "Reports do get messy," he continued, "but patterns do not." He reached down and turned another page, revealing a series of entries lined up with precision. Dates, times, locations, each one connected not by assumption, but by repetition. "This is not one report," Marcus said, his tone steady. "This is a sequence." The words settled into the room differently, heavier, because they suggested something larger than a single moment, something that could not be dismissed as easily. Ethan's eyes moved across the page again, slower this time, the confidence in his posture tightening into something more controlled. Across the table, one of the younger officers shifted in his seat, glancing between Marcus and the documents as if seeing the situation from a new angle. Captain Blake remained silent, arms still crossed, but his attention was fully locked in now, no longer observing from a distance, but witnessing the process unfold exactly as intended. Marcus did not press further immediately. He allowed the information to sit, to do its work without force, because he understood something the others were only beginning to realize, that truth, when presented clearly enough, does not need to be pushed, it stands on its own. "We are going to review each case connected to these entries," Marcus said after a moment, his voice carrying a quiet finality, not to challenge authority, but to reinforce it where it is earned. He paused, letting that distinction settle, because it mattered, because it separated what this was from what they might assume it to be. Ethan leaned back again. But this time there was no ease in the movement, only calculation, as if he was trying to regain ground without knowing exactly where he had lost it. "And if nothing is wrong?" he asked, his tone measured, controlled, almost testing. Marcus met his gaze directly, not with confrontation, but with clarity. "Then the record will reflect that," he said simply, and that answer left no room for argument, because it offered fairness without compromise, the kind that does not bend but also does not accuse without reason. The room shifted again, but this time it was quieter, more internal, officers looking at the documents, at each other, at Marcus, reassessing not just him, but the entire structure they had taken for granted that morning. The veteran officer near the back gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not to Marcus directly, but to the process itself, recognizing it for what it was, something necessary, something long overdue. Marcus closed the folder again, not as an end, but as a pause, a signal that this was only the beginning. "We will start with the most recent reports," he said, his voice steady, "and move backward until the pattern is clear or disproven." He straightened slightly, his posture relaxed but grounded. And for the first time since the meeting began, the room did not resist the direction. It absorbed it, because what Marcus had done was not overpower them. He had removed the space for denial, and in its place left only one option, to face what was there, not what they preferred to believe. And as the meeting prepared to move forward, one thing had become undeniable. The man they had dismissed at the door was now defining the standard inside the room. And there was no longer any question about who was giving the orders. The meeting did not end with raised voices or sudden decisions. It unfolded with a quiet precision that made it far more unsettling. Because instead of pushing back, instead of arguing, the room began to comply, not out of agreement, but out of necessity. Marcus remained at the head of the table now, not because he had claimed it, but because the structure of the room had shifted around him. And when he spoke again, it was not to challenge, but to direct. "We will begin with the dispatch logs from last Thursday," he said, his voice steady, as if the choice had already been made long before this moment. A few officers reached for their tablets, others for printed reports. The sound of pages turning, replacing what used to be casual conversation. Ethan hesitated for just a fraction of a second before pulling the document closer, his movements controlled, deliberate, as if he could maintain authority through composure alone. Marcus stepped slightly to the side, giving the table a clearer view of the documents, but also positioning himself where he could see every reaction, every shift in posture, every glance exchanged between officers who were beginning to realize this was not routine. Timestamp at 14:32. Marcus continued, pointing lightly to a line on the page, not tapping, not forcing attention, just guiding it. Dispatch records show the call was logged at 14:28. He paused, allowing the 4-minute gap to settle into the room. Not exaggerated, not dramatized, just present. Can anyone explain the discrepancy? The question was open, not directed at Ethan, not yet, but the weight of it leaned in his direction regardless. One of the younger officers spoke first, voice cautious. It could be a delay in logging, he offered, not confidently, but not entirely uncertain either. Marcus nodded slightly, acknowledging the possibility without confirming it. That is correct, he said, and that is why we verify. He turned another page, revealing a second report tied to the same time frame. However, this entry reflects a response time that would require immediate dispatch. He let the implication rest there, subtle but clear. Ethan leaned forward again, this time more quickly, as if trying to regain control of the narrative. Before it moved too far beyond his reach, we responded as fast as we could, he said, his tone firm, but no longer relaxed. Marcus looked at him, not sharply, not accusingly, just directly. I am not questioning effort, he replied. I am aligning facts, and that distinction shifted the ground again, because it removed the emotional defense and replaced it with something harder to argue against. Across the table, the veteran officer spoke up for the first time, his voice low but steady. If the logs do not match, then something was entered late, he said, not as a challenge, but as a statement of process. Marcus inclined his head slightly. Exactly, he said, and our responsibility is to understand why. The room grew quieter again, but this time it was not resistance, it was focus, officers leaning in slightly, attention narrowing, because the conversation was no longer about authority, it was about accuracy, and accuracy did not take sides. Marcus stepped back half a pace, giving space again, not dominating the table, but controlling the direction. Let us move to the next report, he said. Turning another page, same unit, different date. The pattern began to form more clearly now, not as an accusation, but as a sequence that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Ethan's posture shifted again, shoulders tightening just enough to reveal the pressure building beneath the surface. He glanced briefly toward Captain Blake, as if expecting intervention, but Blake remained still, silent, allowing the process to continue without interruption, and that silence spoke louder than any command. Marcus did not rush, did not stack evidence too quickly. He let each piece land, one at a time, building not a case, but a clarity that the room could not ignore. We are not here to rush conclusions, Marcus said after another moment, his voice calm, almost steadying. We are here to make sure that what we record reflects what actually happened. He closed the file halfway again, leaving it open just enough to signal continuation, not completion, because once it is written, it becomes the standard others rely on. The words settled deeper than anything he had said so far, because they were not about the past, they were about responsibility, about what this room represented beyond itself. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back once more, but this time there was no attempt to reclaim control, only an effort to hold ground that was steadily shifting beneath him. And as the room prepared to move into the next set of reports, one realization had begun to take hold, quiet but undeniable. This was not an investigation that Marcus was entering. It was one he had already begun long before anyone else realized they were part of it. By early afternoon, the room no longer felt like a place where people worked. It felt like a place where things were being uncovered one layer at a time, and the difference between those two states was something you could feel without anyone saying it out loud. Marcus did not raise his voice, did not accelerate the pace, but the direction had become undeniable. Each report they reviewed added another line to a pattern that was no longer subtle. no longer easy to explain away, and the more it revealed itself, the quieter Ethan became, not silent, but selective, choosing his words more carefully now, measuring each response as if aware that every sentence could be weighed against something already written. Marcus turned to another page, sliding it slightly toward the center this time, not just toward Ethan, but toward the entire group. "This one is from 2 weeks ago," he said, his tone consistent, steady. "Same unit, same sequence, similar timing discrepancy." The repetition landed differently now, because it was no longer hypothetical. It was established. One of the officers across the table leaned in closer, scanning the page with a furrowed brow. "That is not just a delay," he said quietly, almost to himself. Marcus nodded once, not in agreement with the conclusion, but in acknowledgement of the observation, because the room was beginning to see it on its own, and that mattered more than any direct accusation. Ethan shifted again, his hand resting flat on the table now. No longer tapping, no longer signaling control, just steadying himself. "You are connecting things that are not necessarily related," he said, his voice controlled, but carrying a tighter edge. Marcus met his gaze, not with resistance, but with clarity. "Then we will separate them," he replied, simple, direct, leaving no space for argument, and that response did something subtle but significant. It removed the idea of bias entirely, replaced it with process, with structure, with something that did not depend on opinion. Captain Blake finally moved, just slightly, stepping closer to the table, his presence reinforcing the shift without interrupting it. "Continue," he said, not to Marcus as a command, but as confirmation. And that single word settled any remaining uncertainty about who was leading this room now. Marcus turned another page. But this time he did not present it immediately. He paused, letting the silence build just long enough to draw full attention. Then he placed the document down with deliberate care. "This report includes a recorded statement," he said, his voice calm, "and a corresponding log entry." He glanced briefly at Ethan, not confrontational, just precise. "The wording in the statement does not match the sequence in the log." The room tightened again, but this time there was no confusion, only recognition. The pattern was no longer forming. It had formed, and everyone could see it. Ethan's jaw set slightly, his eyes moving between the page and Marcus, searching for something to push back against, something to challenge, but finding less space to do so with each passing moment. The veteran officer leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "If the sequence is off," he said slowly, "then either the report was written after the fact or something was recorded incorrectly." Marcus inclined his head again. "Those are the possibilities," he said. And then he added, after a brief pause that carried more weight than the words themselves, "And both require review." No emphasis, no pressure, just a statement that could not be ignored. The room fell into a different kind of silence now, not the silence of uncertainty, but the silence of understanding. The kind that comes when the truth is no longer hidden behind complexity, when it stands clear enough that denying it would require more effort than accepting it. Marcus closed the file gently, not fully, just enough to mark the end of this phase. "We will proceed with a full audit of all related reports," he said, his voice steady. "Each entry will be verified against dispatch logs, recorded statements, and timeline consistency." He looked around the table, not asserting dominance, but establishing expectation. "This is not optional." And again, it was not the words themselves, but the certainty behind them that settled the room into place. Ethan leaned back slowly, the resistance in his posture now replaced by something quieter, something more internal. Because for the first time since the morning began, he was no longer reacting to Marcus as a person. He was reacting to the structure Marcus had put in place, and that structure did not bend, did not argue, did not need to prove itself. It simply held. And as the meeting moved forward into the next phase, one thing had become clear in a way that could not be undone. The man they had dismissed at the door was not just leading the investigation. He was redefining the standard they would all be measured against. By the time the final set of documents was laid out across the table, the room no longer felt like it belonged to any one person. It belonged to the truth that had been unfolding piece by piece, and that truth had a weight that could not be ignored or redirected. Marcus did not rush to close the session. He allowed the silence to expand, not as a pause, but as a space for realization. Because what had been presented was no longer a theory, it was a structure, consistent, repeatable, and now visible to everyone in that room. Ethan sat still, his eyes fixed on the documents in front of him, not scanning anymore, not searching for gaps, but reading, actually reading, as if for the first time he was seeing the reports not as something he controlled, but as something that could be questioned. And that shift alone changed everything. Marcus stepped back from the table slightly, giving the room space again. His presence no longer something that needed to push forward, because it had already settled into place. "We will take a short recess," Marcus said, his voice even, not signaling an end, but a transition. Chairs moved quietly. Officers stood, some stretching, others remaining seated, but no one left immediately, because leaving would have meant stepping away from something that had not yet fully resolved. Captain Blake walked to the side of the room, exchanging a brief, quiet word with the veteran officer, both of them glancing once toward Marcus before looking back at the documents. A silent acknowledgement that what was happening was not routine. Marcus remained where he was, not engaging in side conversations, not seeking validation, just standing with the same calm presence he had carried since the morning, and that calm now meant something different, not passivity, but control. Ethan finally stood, slower than the others, his posture no longer loose, but measured. He walked a few steps away from the table, then stopped, turning back toward Marcus, hesitation visible for just a moment before he spoke. "You came in here knowing all of this," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier edge. Marcus looked at him, not surprised, not defensive, just present. "I came in here to understand it fully," Marcus replied. And that answer, simple as it was, carried a depth that made it difficult to challenge. Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing back at the table, at the reports, at the pattern that had been laid out with quiet precision. "You could have said something this morning," he added, not accusing, but questioning. Marcus held his gaze for a moment, then answered. Would it have mattered? And that question did not need emphasis, because the answer was already clear, not just to Ethan, but to anyone who had been in that room since the beginning of the day. The laughter, the dismissal, the assumptions, all of it replayed silently in the space between them. Ethan did not respond immediately, because there was no immediate response that would hold, no quick answer that could undo what had already been revealed. Across the room, a few officers began quietly discussing the documents, their voices low but focused, no longer casual, no longer dismissive. The tone had changed. Marcus turned slightly, looking back at the table, his attention returning to the work itself rather than the moment, because for him, this was not about confrontation, it was about completion. Captain Blake stepped forward again, his presence steady, his voice calm. "We reconvene in 5 minutes," he said, and this time there was no hesitation, no delay. The room responded, not out of habit, but out of alignment, because the structure had been set, and everyone now understood where they stood within it. Ethan remained where he was for a second longer, then gave a small nod, not to Marcus directly, but to the situation itself, an acknowledgement that something had shifted beyond personal control. Marcus returned the nod, subtle, almost imperceptible, then closed the folder completely, not as an ending, but as a signal that the next phase would begin, with everything now in full view. And as the officers slowly took their seats again, the room felt different in a way that could not be reversed, not because someone had taken power, but because power had been clarified, and in that clarity, there was no longer any space for misunderstanding. When the room settled again, it did not return to what it had been that morning. It became something else entirely, something quieter but far more aware. Chairs were pulled in with intention, not habit. Eyes no longer drifted casually, but stayed focused. And for the first time since Marcus had walked through that door, no one questioned why he was standing at the front. They already knew. Marcus opened the folder once more, but this time there was no build-up, no gradual layering. Everything that needed to be seen had already been placed on the table. "We move forward from here," he said, his voice calm, steady, carrying the kind of finality that does not need to repeat itself. "Each report will be corrected where necessary, each timeline verified, and each statement aligned with the facts." He paused briefly, not for effect, but to let the direction settle into something actionable. This is how we restore accuracy. No one interrupted, not because they could not, but because there was nothing left to challenge without ignoring what had already been made clear. Ethan sat upright now, no longer leaning back, no longer signaling control, his posture aligned with the rest of the room, attentive, contained, his earlier confidence replaced by something more grounded, more aware. Marcus turned a single page, then closed the folder fully, the soft sound marking a shift from review to conclusion. What matters is not what was assumed. He continued, his gaze moving across the room, meeting each person not as individuals being judged, but as part of a system being corrected. What matters is what can be verified. The words settled deeper than anything before them, because they removed interpretation entirely, leaving only truth as the standard. Captain Blake stepped forward slightly, his presence reinforcing the moment without taking it over. "You have your directives," he said, his tone measured, but there was something different in it now, something aligned rather than authoritative. Officers began to nod, not in agreement with Marcus as a person, but with the process he had established, because it had proven itself in real time. Ethan finally spoke, but this time there was no edge, no resistance, just a controlled acknowledgement. "Understood," he said, and that single word carried more weight than any argument he had made earlier, because it signaled a shift not just in behavior, but in perspective. Marcus met his gaze briefly, then gave a small nod, not as approval, but as recognition of the moment. The room began to move again, files gathered, notes taken, but the energy had changed, no longer casual, no longer dismissive. Every action now carried intention, because the standard had been made clear. Marcus stepped away from the table, not lingering in the center, not holding attention longer than necessary, because his role was not to dominate the space, but to define it, and that had already been done. As the officers filtered out, conversations began again, but they were different now, quieter, more precise, focused on details rather than assumptions. Ethan paused at the doorway, glancing back once more at the table where everything had shifted, then turned and walked out without another word. Marcus remained for a moment longer, looking at the empty chairs, the cleared table, the space that had transformed in just a few hours, and then he turned as well, leaving the room exactly as it was meant to be, not controlled by noise, not shaped by ego, but grounded in something far more difficult to ignore, because in the end, he had not needed to prove who he was. The truth had done that for him, and it had done it in a way no one in that room would forget.